The Xinthian exploration vessel moved silently through the darkness of space, its hull reflecting the distant light of stars as it approached the outer edge of the Kepler 442 system. Commander Vexthal stood on the bridge, his tall frame casting shadows across the control panels, while his crew worked with quiet efficiency around him. They had been mapping this sector for 3 months now, searching for mineral deposits and cataloging uninhabited worlds. But today, something felt different. The science officer Mirana looked up from her console with an expression that Vexthal had rarely seen in their 15 years of working together. Her crest was fully extended, which in Xinthian culture meant surprise or confusion, and her fingers moved rapidly across the holographic display as she double-checked her readings. She called out to the commander in a voice that barely concealed her excitement, telling him that they had found artificial structures on the 4th planet in the system. The energy signatures were weak but unmistakable, and the patterns matched those of constructed buildings rather than natural formations. Vexthal moved to her station and studied the data streaming across the screen. The planet designated Kepler 442d showed clear signs of terraforming, with vast forests covering much of the surface and rivers cutting through valleys between mountain ranges. Small settlements dotted the landscape, connected by roads that wound through the terrain like threads in a tapestry. He ordered the ship to establish orbit and prepare for a detailed scan, knowing that any discovery of this magnitude required careful investigation. As the Harmony's edge settled into a stable orbit above the planet, the crew began their analysis with practiced precision. The atmospheric readings showed oxygen levels suitable for most carbon-based life forms, and the temperature ranges indicated a climate that had been deliberately modified to support agriculture. The settlements themselves were small, perhaps a few thousand inhabitants each, and they showed no signs of advanced technology like power grids or communication networks. Then Mirana made the discovery that changed everything. She had been analyzing biological scans of the inhabitants when her equipment identified their genetic markers as human. The bridge fell silent as everyone processed this information, because humans were well known throughout the Galactic Coalition as a spacefaring species with dozens of established colonies across multiple sectors. But this settlement bore no identification markers, no beacon signals, nothing that connected it to Earth or any of the registered human worlds. Vexthal immediately ordered a search of the historical databases, cross-referencing the architectural patterns and settlement layouts with records of human expansion. The results came back within minutes, and they painted a fascinating picture. The structures on the planet below matched designs from nearly 400 years ago, during humanity's first chaotic wave of colonization, when ships had spread out across the stars, with minimal coordination or record-keeping. Many of those early colonies had failed, their inhabitants dying from disease, starvation, or simple inability to adapt to alien worlds. But this colony had clearly survived. The settlements looked well-maintained, the agricultural fields showed careful cultivation, and the biosigns indicated a healthy population of approximately 50,000 humans spread across 7 major towns. Vexthal felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as he considered what this meant. A lost human colony, isolated for centuries, had somehow managed not just to survive, but apparently to thrive. In complete isolation from the rest of their species, he called a meeting of his senior officers in the conference room, a circular space with windows that looked out onto the planet below. The ship's xenoanthropologist, a quiet Telleran named Sormix, expressed concern about the psychological impact that first contact might have on a population that had been isolated for so long. The security chief worried about potential hostility, pointing out that isolated populations sometimes developed xenophobic tendencies. Mirana argued for immediate contact, saying that the humans deserved to know they were no longer alone in the universe. Vexthal listened to all their arguments before making his decision. They would send a small team to the surface, approaching the largest settlement with clear, peaceful intentions. They would be honest about who they were and why they had come, and they would respect whatever response the humans gave them. If the colonists wanted to be left alone, the coalition would honor that choice. But at minimum, they needed to verify that these people were safe and healthy. The landing party was selected with care. Vexthal would lead it himself, accompanied by Mirana, two security officers trained in first contact protocols, and Sormix to provide cultural guidance. They would wear their standard uniforms but carry no visible weapons, approaching on foot from the outskirts of the settlement to appear as non-threatening as possible. The universal translators were calibrated to handle archaic forms of human languages, accounting for the linguistic drift that might have occurred over 4 centuries. The shuttle descended through wispy clouds and landed in a meadow about a kilometer from the town. As the landing ramp extended, Vexthal took a deep breath of the alien air and found it pleasant, carrying the scent of growing things and distant wood smoke. The town ahead was built primarily of wood and stone, with buildings that looked sturdy and well-crafted despite their simple construction. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance they could hear the faint sounds of human activity. They had barely started walking when a group of humans emerged from the town to meet them. At the front was a woman who appeared to be in her middle years, dressed in practical clothing that looked hand-woven from natural fibers. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, but her eyes were clear and intelligent as she studied the approaching aliens. Behind her came perhaps 20 other humans, ranging from children who peeked out from behind adult legs to elderly individuals who walked with the aid of carved wooden staffs. The woman raised her hand in greeting, a gesture of peace that translated across cultures, and called out to them in clear English. She introduced herself as Linda Hayes, elected speaker for the town of New Haven, and welcomed them as travelers to their world. Her calm demeanor surprised Vexthal, because he had expected fear or confusion. But Linda showed neither. Instead, she seemed almost expectant, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Vexthal stepped forward and activated his translator, introducing himself and explaining that they were representatives of the Galactic Coalition. He told Linda that they had no record of any human colony in this system and asked how long her people had been here. Her answer stopped him cold. The colony ship Morning Star had arrived in 2187, she explained, and its systems had failed shortly after landing. They had lost all contact with Earth and had been forced to survive using only what they could salvage and what they could learn to create from local resources. 382 years. These humans had been alone for nearly 4 centuries, cut off from their homeworld and from the technological support that most colonies depended upon. By every statistical model Vexthal knew, they should have failed within 2 generations. Yet here they stood, healthy and calm, greeting alien visitors with courtesy rather than fear. Linda asked if they would like to see the town, and Vexthal accepted, knowing that whatever they found in New Haven would challenge everything he thought he knew about human resilience and adaptation. Linda led them through the entrance to New Haven, walking along a packed dirt road that showed the wear of countless feet over many years. The aliens followed in silence, their trained eyes taking in every detail of this impossible settlement. The first thing that struck Vexthal was the craftsmanship visible in every structure they passed. The buildings were constructed from local timber and stone, fitted together with obvious skill and care. Roofs were thatched or covered with wooden shingles, and every home had windows fitted with what appeared to be hand-blown glass. Gardens surrounded nearly every building, bursting with vegetables and fruits that the xenobotanist in their group would later identify as modified Earth species adapted to local conditions. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing between buildings, and they stared at the alien visitors with curiosity rather than fear. Elderly humans sat on porches, weaving baskets or carving wood, and they nodded politely as the group passed. The entire scene radiated a sense of peace and contentment that seemed almost too perfect to be real. A young man approached them carrying a large basket filled with golden brown bread that released a smell so appealing even the aliens noticed it. He introduced himself as Paul Griffin and explained that he was one of the town's bakers. He offered them bread with such genuine hospitality that Mirana accepted a piece, scanning it quickly with her concealed medical sensor before taking a cautious bite. The bread was excellent, nutritionally complete, and flavored with herbs that grew locally. Paul explained that they had spent generations learning which earth grains would grow in their soil and how to enhance them with native plants to create food that was both nourishing and delicious. As they walked deeper into the town, Vexthal observed the way people interacted with one another. A group of adults were working together to repair a fence, passing tools back and forth without discussion as if they instinctively knew what each person needed. Two women sat under a tree, one teaching the other to use a spinning wheel to turn raw fiber into thread. A cluster of children helped an elderly man carry water from a central well to his home, chatting with him as they worked. Every interaction showed cooperation and mutual support that went beyond mere politeness. Linda took them to the town center, where a large building served as a combination meeting hall, school, and community gathering space. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves holding books, most of them hand-copied or printed on simple presses that had been built from salvaged materials. A teacher named Betty Adams was conducting a lesson with children who ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 15 years old. The older children were helping the younger ones with their reading, demonstrating a teaching method that involved peer learning rather than strict age-based segregation. The curriculum visible on the chalkboard covered basic mathematics, ecology, and what appeared to be a history lesson about Earth. Betty explained that they taught children practical skills like farming and carpentry alongside academic subjects, believing that education should prepare people for real life rather than abstract knowledge alone. She also emphasized that they spent considerable time teaching children about emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and the importance of community responsibility. Vexthal asked to see their medical facilities, expecting primitive conditions that would explain why these humans looked so healthy despite their isolation. What he found instead was a clean, well-organized clinic run by a doctor named Karen White. She showed them shelves stocked with medicines made from local plants, their properties carefully documented over generations of experimentation. Karen explained that their ancestors had brought basic medical knowledge from Earth, but they had expanded it by testing native flora and learning which plants had healing properties. The clinic's records showed remarkably low rates of serious illness. Karen attributed this to their lifestyle rather than to superior medicine. The colonists ate fresh, unprocessed food, worked physically every day, lived without the stress of competition or scarcity, and maintained strong social connections that provided emotional support. When serious injuries or illnesses did occur, the entire community rallied to help, ensuring that patients had whatever they needed for recovery. Mirana was particularly interested in how they had avoided the genetic bottleneck problems that plagued most small populations. Linda explained that their ancestors had been very deliberate about encouraging diversity and partnerships, and had maintained detailed family records to prevent accidental inbreeding. They also had a cultural tradition of encouraging people to form families with partners from other settlements, which kept genetic variety high across their entire population. As the afternoon progressed, the landing party observed more of daily life in New Haven. They watched craftspeople in workshops creating tools, furniture, and clothing with skills that had been refined over centuries. They saw farmers returning from fields, their harvest shared among multiple families rather than sold or hoarded. They noticed that there were no locks on doors, no guards watching for thieves, no visible hierarchy of wealth or power. When Vexthal commented on this, Linda invited them to stay for the evening meal, which was served communally in the large hall. Families arrived carrying dishes they had prepared, placing them on long tables for everyone to share. The aliens were offered seats of honor, and the humans seemed genuinely pleased to have guests rather than threatened by their presence. During the meal, Linda explained their economic system, or rather their lack of one. They did not use money, she told them. Resources were shared based on need rather than earned through labor. Everyone contributed what they could to the community, and everyone received what they required to live well. A farmer's work was no more or less valuable than a teacher's or a craftsperson's. They had found that when people's basic needs were guaranteed, they naturally wanted to contribute and take pride in their work, without requiring monetary incentives or the threat of poverty. Sormix asked the question that had been bothering all of them. How did they prevent laziness or selfishness in such a system? Linda smiled and explained that such behaviors were rare because they raised children to understand that their well-being was connected to the community's well-being. People who contributed generously were respected and appreciated, while those who took without giving back were gently encouraged to examine why they felt unable to participate. They treated antisocial behavior as a symptom of unmet needs or unhealed pain, rather than as a moral failing requiring punishment. After the meal, there was music and storytelling. Several people brought out instruments that had been crafted locally, playing melodies that blended Earth musical traditions with new compositions created over centuries. Children performed a play they had written about the arrival of the morning star, showing remarkable creativity and confidence. Elderly members of the community told stories, some historical and some fictional, while the audience listened with genuine interest. Vexthal sat beside Linda and asked her the question that had been forming in his mind all day. How had they done this? How had they avoided the collapse that claimed so many isolated colonies? How had they built not just a surviving community, but a thriving one, where people seemed genuinely happy and fulfilled? Linda was quiet for a long moment, watching her fellow colonists laugh and sing together. Then she explained that when the morning star failed, their ancestors had faced a fundamental choice. They could panic, fight over the limited resources, establish hierarchies based on strength or cunning, and likely destroy themselves within a generation. Or they could accept their situation and consciously decide what kind of society they wanted to build. They chose compassion over competition. They chose cooperation over conflict. They established principles that valued every person's contribution and ensured everyone's basic needs were met. They taught their children that the community's strength came from mutual support rather than individual achievement, and they maintained those principles across 4 centuries, refining and improving them, but never abandoning the core values that had allowed them to survive. As night fell and the gathering dispersed, families walking home under unfamiliar stars, Vexthal realized that what he had witnessed today would change everything. These humans had not merely survived isolation, they had used it to build something that most advanced civilizations had never achieved. A society based on genuine care for one another, on sufficiency rather than excess, on wisdom rather than mere knowledge. And they had done it without technology, without outside support, with nothing but human ingenuity and a conscious choice to value kindness above all else. The Xinthian team spent the next week immersing themselves in the daily rhythms of New Haven, and each day brought new revelations that challenged their understanding of how societies could function. Vexthal rose early one morning to accompany a farmer named Greg Matthews to his fields, wanting to understand how their agricultural system worked without the concept of private ownership. The sun was just breaking over the eastern mountains as they walked through dewy grass toward expansive fields of grain that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Greg worked alongside 11 other people, a mixed group that included young adults and middle-aged farmers, all moving through the rows with practiced efficiency. They weeded, checked plants for disease, and discussed which sections would be ready for harvest soon. When Mirana asked Greg to explain who owned these particular fields, he looked genuinely puzzled by the question. He explained that the land belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. His team was responsible for stewarding these fields, but the harvest would be distributed throughout the community based on need rather than stored or sold. Vexthal pressed further, asking what would happen if Greg decided to stop working or if someone from another team tried to take grain from these fields before harvest. Greg laughed and said that such things simply did not happen because everyone understood that they were all dependent on each other. If he stopped working, people would come to him with concern, asking if he was unwell or unhappy, offering help rather than punishment. As for taking grain, why would anyone do that when they knew the harvest would be fairly shared with everyone? The concept seemed almost naive to Vexthal, who had studied dozens of civilizations built on concepts of property, ownership, and controlled resource distribution. Yet here was a system functioning smoothly without any of those frameworks. Greg mentioned that if weather damaged one team's crops, the entire community would share what remained, ensuring no one went hungry. If another settlement needed help during their harvest, people would travel there to assist, knowing that support would be reciprocated when needed. Later that day, Mirana spent time in the workshops where craftspeople created the tools and goods that kept the colony functioning. She met a man named Henry Cole who specialized in metalworking, using a forge built from local materials to shape salvaged metal and iron ore into tools. Henry showed her the workshop's inventory system, which consisted of a simple logbook where people noted what they had taken and what they had returned. There were no locks, no guards, no verification system. When Mirana expressed skepticism about such an honor-based system, Henry invited her to examine the records. They showed consistent patterns of borrowing and returning, with very few instances of tools going missing permanently. Henry explained that in a small community where everyone knew each other, reputation mattered deeply. Not in a fearful way, but people naturally wanted to be seen as reliable and generous. They wanted to be the kind of neighbor who helped others, who returned borrowed items promptly, who contributed their fair share. The education system continued to fascinate the aliens, and Sormix spent several days observing classes taught by Betty Adams and other teachers. The mixed-age approach allowed older children to reinforce their own learning by teaching younger ones, while younger children learned by observing those slightly ahead of them. Students progressed at their own pace, rather than being forced to keep up with arbitrary standards. A child who excelled at mathematics might move ahead in that subject while taking more time with reading, and this was seen as perfectly natural. Betty explained that they taught children to think critically rather than to memorize facts. A history lesson about Earth included discussions about what had gone wrong with old Earth societies, why some had been more peaceful than others, and what lessons could be applied to their own community. Science lessons often took place outdoors, examining local ecosystems and discussing how human activity affected the environment. Mathematics was taught through practical applications like calculating harvest yields or measuring materials for construction. But perhaps most importantly, children learned emotional skills that most civilizations ignored. They practiced identifying their feelings and expressing them constructively. They learned to listen deeply to others, to consider perspectives different from their own, to resolve conflicts through discussion rather than force. They were taught that their value as people was inherent and not dependent on achievement or productivity. The evening community meetings provided another window into how New Haven functioned. Vexthal attended one where a disagreement needed resolution. Two families were in conflict over where to build a new pottery workshop. One family wanted it near the river for easy access to clay and water. The other family lived near that spot and worried about noise and smoke from the kiln disturbing their home. What followed was unlike any conflict resolution Vexthal had witnessed in his years of diplomatic service. There was no judge, no authority figure making decisions. Instead, Linda facilitated a process she called deep listening. Each family presented their perspective without interruption, explaining not just what they wanted, but why it mattered to them. Then other community members asked questions, not to attack or defend, but simply to understand. The family wanting the workshop near the river explained that carrying clay and water long distances would be difficult, especially during winter. The family worried about disturbance explained that they had a young child who needed quiet for afternoon naps, and an elderly grandmother whose breathing was affected by smoke. As the discussion continued, community members suggested various solutions. Could the workshop be placed near the river, but farther from the home? Could it be designed with better ventilation, to reduce smoke? Could work be scheduled to avoid the child's nap times? Gradually, through patient exploration of the problem, a solution emerged that no one had originally considered. The workshop would be built near the river but positioned behind a natural rise in the land that would buffer noise and direct smoke away from the home. A grove of trees would be planted to further filter air and reduce sound. The potters would avoid firing the kiln during midday when the child napped. Both families agreed this addressed their concerns, and the meeting concluded with everyone feeling heard and satisfied. Vexthal asked Linda how often such consensus building failed. She admitted it did not always work perfectly. Sometimes issues were too complex to resolve in one meeting, so they would table the discussion and revisit it after people had time to think. Sometimes they would try a solution on a small scale first to see if it worked before implementing it fully. And sometimes they accepted that there might be multiple valid approaches and allowed different groups to experiment with different solutions. The colony's relationship with their environment particularly impressed the aliens. A young woman named Claire Peterson served as one of several environmental coordinators, and she took the landing party on a tour of the areas surrounding New Haven. She showed them how they had carefully studied the native ecosystem before introducing Earth species, how they monitored the health of local wildlife populations, how they managed their waste through composting and careful recycling systems. Claire explained that their ancestors had quickly learned that aggressive resource extraction would only harm future generations. They could have built bigger settlements, cleared more forests, mined more extensively, but they chose instead to live within the planet's sustainable limits. They asked themselves what they truly needed to live well, rather than how much they could possibly extract and consume. When Mirana asked if this approach limited their growth, Claire responded with a question of her own. Why did they need to grow indefinitely? Their population was stable at a size the planet could comfortably support. They had sufficient food, comfortable shelter, effective medicine, and all the tools they needed. They had time for creativity, learning, art, music, and deep relationships with one another. What would expansion give them that would genuinely improve their quality of life? The question hung in the air, and Mirana found herself unable to provide a satisfactory answer. She had been raised in a culture that valued growth and expansion as fundamental goods. Yet here was a society that had consciously chosen sufficiency over excess, and seemed deeply content with that choice. As the week drew to a close, Sormix compiled his observations into a report that he knew would shake the foundations of xenoanthropological theory. These humans had achieved something that contradicted every model of societal development he had studied. They had created genuine equality without enforced uniformity, maintained order without coercion, ensured productivity without competition, and built happiness on foundations of community rather than individual achievement. Most remarkably, they had sustained this across nearly 400 years, proving it was not merely a temporary phenomenon, but a stable and viable way for humans to organize themselves. Commander Vexthal sat alone in his quarters aboard the Harmony's Edge, staring at the detailed report he was about to transmit to Galactic Coalition headquarters. The document represented a week of careful observation, countless interviews, and analysis of data that defied conventional understanding. He read through it one final time, knowing that what he was about to send would create ripples across the entire coalition. The report described not just a surviving lost colony, but a fundamental challenge to how most civilizations understood social organization and resource distribution. He pressed send and watched the transmission beam away toward the coalition's central hub, located in a system dozens of light-years distant. The response came far more quickly than he anticipated. Within 6 hours, his communication console was flooded with messages from scientists, government officials, historians, and philosophers, all demanding more information about this impossible human colony. The coalition's Secretary of Exploration personally contacted him, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement, as she authorized him to remain in orbit as long as necessary to complete a full study. Within 3 days, the first additional ship arrived. Dr. Thelkor, widely regarded as the coalition's foremost sociologist, had interrupted his research on another world to come see New Haven for himself. The elderly scholar met with Vexthal in the conference room, his aged eyes bright with curiosity as he reviewed the preliminary reports. He explained that he had spent his entire life studying why civilizations rose and fell, and New Haven represented an anomaly that his models could not account for. Isolated colonies faced immense challenges that most could not overcome. Resource scarcity forced difficult choices about distribution. Genetic bottlenecks led to health problems that could doom small populations. Knowledge loss occurred as specialized skills died with individuals. Social fracturing happened when groups competed for limited resources or developed incompatible ideologies. According to statistical analysis of thousands of colony attempts across hundreds of species, the success rate for settlements that lost contact with their homeworld was less than 3%. Yet these humans had not just survived but flourished. Dr. Thelkor asked permission to go down to the surface and spend time among the colonists, and Linda Hayes welcomed him with the same calm hospitality she had shown the first landing party. Over the following weeks, the old scholar walked through fields and workshops, sat in on community meetings, interviewed people from all age groups and occupations, and meticulously documented everything he observed. What he discovered both humbled and excited him in ways he had not felt since he was a young researcher making his first breakthrough. The colony had succeeded by rejecting fundamental assumptions that drove most civilizations forward. They did not pursue endless growth or accumulation of resources. They did not compete for status or hoard wealth. They did not organize themselves into rigid hierarchies with some members controlling others. Instead, they had built their entire society around cooperation, sufficiency, and genuine care for each person's well-being. They had eliminated artificial scarcity by sharing freely, which removed the primary motivation for crime and conflict. Their approach to conflict resolution particularly fascinated Dr. Thelkor. Most societies used punishment to maintain order, operating on the assumption that fear of consequences prevented wrongdoing. New Haven took a completely different approach. When someone caused harm, the community asked what need was not being met. What pain drove the behavior? What circumstances led to the harmful choice? They addressed root causes rather than symptoms, treating antisocial behavior as a problem to be solved, rather than a crime to be punished. This restorative approach required more time and emotional investment than simple punishment. But it produced remarkable results. People who felt valued and supported rarely chose to harm others. Those who did act destructively were given help rather than exile, allowing them to heal and reintegrate rather than becoming permanent outsiders. The system worked because it was supported by a culture that truly believed in second chances and collective responsibility. News of New Haven spread rapidly through the coalition's communication networks. Within a month, the space around the planet was crowded with vessels from dozens of member species, all seeking permission to study this remarkable human settlement. Linda and the other settlement leaders found themselves hosting delegation after delegation, patiently answering the same questions and explaining their history repeatedly. They handled the attention with grace, though Linda privately told Vexthal that it was exhausting to be treated as curiosities rather than simply people. The visitors came with different reactions and agendas. A delegation from the Krill hegemony, a species whose entire civilization was built on strict, hierarchical control, arrived with obvious skepticism. They spent a week searching for the hidden enforcers, the surveillance systems, the coercive mechanisms that must surely exist beneath the surface. When they found none, their leader returned to his ship visibly shaken. He transmitted a report to his government stating that he had witnessed order and productivity without hierarchy or force, and he no longer understood how his own society functioned if such things were possible. Representatives from the Teleran Confederacy, a civilization struggling with severe wealth inequality, had a different reaction. Their lead diplomat spent hours talking with Linda about how resources were distributed, how needs were assessed, how they ensured everyone had enough without creating dependency or laziness. She took detailed notes and asked if some of their principles could be adapted to a much larger population spread across multiple worlds. Linda answered honestly that she did not know. But she believed the core ideas of cooperation and care could scale if people genuinely committed to them. A group of human ambassadors from Earth and the established colonies also arrived, and their reaction was complex. Some felt pride that isolated members of their species had survived and thrived. Others felt uncomfortable, as if New Haven's success implied criticism of how mainstream human society had developed. A few suggested that New Haven should be integrated back into human civilization, given access to modern technology and medicine, brought back into the fold. Linda listened politely to these suggestions and then firmly declined. She explained that while they appreciated the offer, they were not interested in rejoining a civilization built on principles they had consciously rejected. They valued what they had built over 4 centuries, and they would not surrender it simply to gain access to technological conveniences. They were not primitive people, waiting to be rescued. They were a fully realized society that had chosen a different path. The debate about what to do with New Haven reached the highest levels of coalition government. Some officials argued for mandatory integration, claiming that the colonists deserved access to the benefits of galactic civilization, whether they wanted them or not. Others advocated for establishing a protective barrier around the entire system, preserving the colony as a kind of living museum that should never be contaminated by outside influence. Still others suggested that New Haven represented an opportunity for learning that should be carefully managed to benefit both the colonists and the wider galaxy. While politicians debated, scientists and scholars continued their work. Thelcor published a series of papers arguing that New Haven proved cooperation was not just a moral choice but a practical strategy for building stable, sustainable societies. He presented data showing that the colonists were healthier, lived longer, and reported higher life satisfaction than comparable populations in technologically advanced societies. He suggested that perhaps the galaxy had been pursuing the wrong metrics of success, valuing growth and power over happiness and sustainability. Other researchers focused on specific aspects of New Haven's culture. Educational theorists studied their teaching methods and found that children who learned through mixed-age peer groups developed better social skills and retained information more effectively than those in traditional, age-segregated classrooms. Economists analyzed their resource distribution system and discovered that sharing based on need, rather than earning through labor, actually increased productivity because people worked out of genuine motivation rather than fear of poverty. Medical researchers were particularly interested in the colony's health outcomes. Despite lacking advanced technology, the colonists showed remarkably low rates of chronic disease, mental illness, and stress-related conditions. The researchers concluded that the combination of physical activity, fresh, unprocessed food, strong social connections, and lack of chronic stress created conditions for health that no amount of advanced medicine could replicate if those underlying factors were absent. As months passed and research continued, a clear picture emerged. New Haven was not an anomaly or a fluke. It was proof that sapient beings could organize themselves in ways that most civilizations had dismissed as impossible idealism. The colonists had shown that cooperation could triumph over competition, that sufficiency could satisfy more deeply than excess, that community bonds could provide security more effectively than hierarchical control. They had built something precious, and the question now facing the galaxy was what to do with that knowledge. The debate within the Galactic Coalition Council chambers had been raging for 3 months, and no consensus was in sight. Representatives from hundreds of member species argued passionately about what should be done with the human colony that had captured the galaxy's imagination. The chamber was a massive circular space designed to hold thousands of delegates. And today, every seat was filled as beings of countless shapes and forms debated the fate of a small world they had never visited. Councillor Renthai stood at the central podium, her voice amplified to reach every corner of the chamber as she argued for integration. She spoke eloquently about the moral obligation to share advanced medicine with people who still struggled with diseases that could be easily cured. She described the educational opportunities that would open up if colonists could access the accumulated knowledge of thousands of civilizations. She painted a picture of cultural enrichment that would benefit both the colonists and the wider galaxy if New Haven joined the coalition as full members. When she finished, Councillor Mirseth took the podium with an opposing view. He argued that New Haven represented something unique and precious that could easily be destroyed by contact with galactic civilization. He pointed to dozens of cases where isolated cultures had been irreparably damaged by integration, losing their identity and cohesion in the process. He proposed establishing a protected zone around the entire system, prohibiting any contact whatsoever, preserving the colony as a kind of time capsule that future generations could study. The arguments continued for hours, with various delegates offering modifications and alternatives to both positions. Some suggested limited contact for medical purposes only. Others proposed allowing individual colonists to leave if they wished, but preventing anyone from entering. A few radical voices even suggested that New Haven should be studied intensively, and then its social model forcibly implemented across coalition space for the greater good. Commander Vex Thal, watching from the observer's gallery, felt increasingly frustrated with the entire discussion. These politicians were debating the fate of 50,000 human beings without ever asking those people what they wanted. During a recess in the proceedings, He secured a private communication with Counselor Renthai and proposed a solution so obvious he was embarrassed no one had suggested it sooner. They should ask the colonists themselves what they wanted. The idea gained rapid support once it was formally proposed, perhaps because it offered a way out of the deadlock that threatened to drag on indefinitely. Within a week, arrangements were made for a formal meeting on New Haven's surface. Representatives from all the colony's settlements would attend, along with a delegation of coalition officials who would present the various options and listen to the colonists' response. The meeting was held in a large open field on the outskirts of New Haven, with temporary shelters erected to shade participants from the afternoon sun. Hundreds of colonists attended, sitting on the grass or standing at the edges, while the coalition delegation occupied a raised platform that had been constructed for the occasion. Linda Hayes stood at the center, representing not just New Haven but all 7 settlements that comprised their planetary community. The coalition representatives presented their proposals in careful detail. Full integration, with access to technology, medicine, and education. Protected isolation, with no outside contact allowed. Various intermediate options involving limited exchange of knowledge or controlled visits. Each option was explained thoroughly, with time allowed for the colonists to ask questions and discuss among themselves. When all the proposals had been presented, Linda stepped forward to give the colony's response. She thanked the coalition for their interest and concern, acknowledging that the various proposals came from genuine care about their well-being. Then she began to speak about what the colonists had built over 4 centuries, and the field fell silent as everyone listened. She described how their ancestors had faced total disaster when the Morning Star failed, how they had made a conscious choice to build a society based on cooperation and mutual care rather than competition and hierarchy. She explained how generations of their people had refined and improved upon those founding principles, creating a culture that valued every person and ensured everyone's needs were met. She spoke of the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work, strong community bonds, and living in harmony with their environment. Then she addressed the offers that had been made. Yes, the galaxy could offer them medicine that would extend their lives and cure diseases they struggled with. Yes, they could gain access to vast repositories of knowledge and powerful technologies. Yes, they could become part of a civilization that spanned thousands of worlds and countless species. But what would they lose in the process? Linda asked the assembled coalition representatives to consider what would happen if New Haven truly integrated into galactic society. Would they be pressured to adopt economic systems based on scarcity and competition? Would corporations arrive seeking to extract their planet's resources? Would their children be drawn away by the promise of excitement and opportunity elsewhere, breaking the multi-generational continuity that made their community strong? Would they face subtle and not-so-subtle pressure to abandon the principles that had sustained them because those principles challenged how the rest of the galaxy organized itself? She was not speaking from fear or xenophobia, she emphasized. The colonists were not afraid of the wider galaxy, but they had built something precious, something that had taken their ancestors tremendous effort and sacrifice to create. They were not willing to risk losing it simply to gain access to technological conveniences. Then Linda presented the colony's counterproposal. They would accept limited contact with the Galactic Coalition, but only on carefully defined terms. They would welcome medical knowledge, particularly for conditions they currently could not treat effectively. They would be interested in cultural and scientific exchange with other civilizations, sharing what they had learned and learning from others. They would even allow some of their people to travel to other worlds if those individuals wished to experience the wider galaxy, provided they were free to return home whenever they chose. But they insisted on maintaining their autonomy and protecting their way of life. They did not want tourists flooding their world to gawk at the unusual humans. They did not want researchers treating them as experimental subjects. They did not want corporations seeking profit or missionaries seeking converts. They did not want to become dependent on outside trade or technology that could be withdrawn if their political situation changed. They wanted to remain masters of their own world and their own destiny. The field was silent as Linda finished speaking. The coalition representatives conferred among themselves in hushed voices, and Vexthal could see the surprise and respect on their faces. These humans were not pleading to be saved or demanding to be left alone. They were negotiating as equals, clearly stating their terms and standing firm in their principles. Finally, Councillor Renthai stood and announced the coalition's decision. They would accept the colony's terms. New Haven and its associated settlements would be recognized as an independent protectorate under coalition law. A small liaison station would be established in orbit to facilitate the limited exchange that the colonists had agreed to, but the planet's surface would remain under their complete control. No exploitation would be permitted, no forced integration, no interference in their internal affairs. Renthai's voice grew softer as she added a personal observation. Perhaps, she suggested, the coalition had more to learn from New Haven than New Haven had to learn from the coalition. Perhaps the values and principles that had allowed these isolated humans to thrive deserved serious consideration rather than dismissal as impractical idealism. In the weeks that followed, the agreement was formalized and the orbital station constructed. A carefully selected team of coalition medical specialists began working with New Haven's doctors, sharing knowledge of advanced treatments while respecting the colony's desire to maintain their self-sufficiency. Cultural exchange programs were established, allowing interested colonists to meet with representatives from other civilizations and share their respective experiences. Most significantly, scholars from across the galaxy began seriously studying New Haven's social model, not as a curiosity, but as a potential blueprint for addressing problems their own civilizations faced. Universities established research programs focused on cooperation-based economics. Governments formed committees to explore how restorative justice might work in their own legal systems. Educational institutions experimented with mixed-age peer learning programs. Not everyone was convinced. Many beings dismissed New Haven as a special case, too small and isolated to provide lessons applicable to complex multi-world civilizations. Others felt threatened by the implicit challenge to systems that had served them well, or at least served their interests. But seeds of change had been planted, and some of those seeds would eventually grow into movements that transformed how entire civilizations organized themselves. Commander Vexthal prepared to leave orbit and return to his normal duties, but before departing he made one final trip to the surface to say goodbye to Linda Hayes. They met on the same hillside where they had talked months earlier, looking out over New Haven as evening light painted the buildings gold. He told her honestly that her people had given the galaxy an unexpected gift. They had proven that alternatives were possible, that cooperation could triumph over competition, that sufficiency could satisfy more deeply than excess. They had shown that beings throughout the galaxy had greater capacity for compassion and community than most civilizations believed possible. Linda smiled and said they had also received a gift. Knowing they were not alone in the universe, that countless other beings existed who struggled with the same fundamental questions about how to live together peacefully, gave their own efforts greater meaning. Their isolation had allowed them to develop something unique, but connection to the wider galaxy would enrich that, rather than diminish it, as long as they maintained control over the terms of that connection. As the Harmony's edge lifted from New Haven and set course for distant stars, Vexthal looked back at the planet below. The settlements glowed softly in the gathering darkness. Small pockets of warmth and community against the vast emptiness of space. His people had come seeking a lost colony and found something far more valuable. Proof that sapient beings could choose kindness over cruelty, cooperation over conflict, and community over isolation. The discovery would echo across the galaxy for generations to come, challenging assumptions and inspiring experiments in new ways of living together. Some civilizations would dismiss the lessons New Haven offered, others would embrace them partially. A few might even attempt to replicate the entire social model. But regardless of how individual societies responded, the example existed now as undeniable proof that alternatives were possible. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest gift these isolated humans had given the galaxy. The knowledge that the future was not fixed, that different choices, could lead to different outcomes, and that beings of any species could build societies based on genuine care for one another if they had the courage to try.